Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Nicholas DiSabatino. I'm the Global Publicity Manager here at the MIT Press. We're so thrilled to be co-hosting this event with the Digital Public Library of America. And I'm so very excited for you all to meet today's guests. Ruchika Tulshyan is an award-winning inclusion strategist and speaker, as well as the CEO and founder of Candor, which works with organizations to create diverse teams and inclusive cultures. A former business journalist, she writes regularly on inclusive leadership for the Harvard Business Review, and she is the author of Inclusion on Purpose, an intersectional approach to creating a culture of belonging at work. Jennifer Aitley is an entrepreneur, a documentary producer, journalist, seed investor, and emoji activist. She is the co-founder of a literary studio called Plimpton, which focuses on innovation and publishing. A former New York Times reporter, she is also the author of the Fortune Cookie Chronicles and the co-author of the forthcoming book from MIT Press, The Handmoji Handbook, Your Guide to the Chinese Language Through Emoji. We will begin with a discussion between Ruchika and Jennifer, and then save some time at the end for audience Q&A. Jennifer and Ruchika, welcome to you both, and I leave it to you both to take it away. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Well, I'm really excited. I read the book in the last week and was excited, in fact, hard to see like a lot of my friends are mentioned in the book. So it was cool to know that my social circle is sort of active on these issues. But so Ruchika, one of my favorite quotes in the book is where you quote a Netflix executive who works on diversity and inclusion, and then amplify it, which is this idea that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, and then equity is actually being part of the planning committee. And I was wondering if you can kind of walk through why that's true and what the different levels of sort of being engaged on like issues of diversity and inclusion mean in actuality for companies.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you for all the work you've done all this while and continue to do. And I think the fact that your social circle is very active, they're actually leaders, which is, like yourself, which is just incredible. And so one of the reasons why I really love this quote by Werner Myers, VP of Inclusion at Netflix, diversity is being asked to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, is because it's something that really translates across cultures. It's actually something I found, I've been fortunate to speak, and also my own journey as someone who was born outside the United States. I'm from Singapore. And so as I would speak to audiences on a more global level, this was one framing that really resonated, right? Like, we all know what it's like to be invited or not invited to the party. We all know what it's like to feel like we've been asked to dance or not. So that was something that really seemed to resonate. The reason why equity is so important, and really equity, is recognizing that there are systemic barriers that exist that prevent people from, whether it's being invited to the party or being asked to dance, right? And if we extrapolate that into a workplace setting, inviting people means, are they being recruited into the organization? And then inclusion and being asked to dance is really, do they feel like they have been asked to speak up and share their perspectives and lead? And the reason why I focus so much on equity is because equity is a process. It's not an outcome. You can certainly measure who's there in the workplace today. What are the demographics? You can certainly, you can certainly find, and you can certainly measure what inclusion looks like. Are people feeling like they can speak up and their voices are being heard? But I think that the reality with equity, which is challenging, but so necessary, is to center on what are those barriers that have prevented people from being present and like they can belong in the workplace. And what can we do to dismantle them, right? And if we extend that metaphor of a party, do they feel like they are actually creating the norms around the workplace and making sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak up and share? And so, I think that as we become deeper, as we become more, I think as a society, I see more of us are talking about diversity and inclusion in the workplace in a much more sophisticated way than certainly I had ever seen in the years that I started doing this work. Certainly, I remember being in the technology industry and the words diversity and inclusion were barely ever used. And now being able to come to a space where I think people understand what it means, the focus on equity is really necessary.
And in terms of reading through your book, I was really struck by basically the cost of the lack of psychological safety in the workplace and how that really erodes. I mean, there's productivity, there's nutrition that comes from it. And in terms of doing your own research on the issue, I mean, do you think enough people are aware of like what it means not to have psychological safety in the workplace?
You know, Jenny, this is what's so fascinating about psychological safety. When I define it, and when I define it really in terms of the academic research terms that it was developed to represent, people intuitively get it. And I think that's what's so powerful about psychological safety. Once you understand it, it's kind of like fully becoming aware of what exclusion and bias look like and working towards a more inclusive workplace. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's something that I really deeply, passionately believe is going to be the way forward. That awareness, that ability to really identify, oh, this is what in this situation I'm witnessing, or maybe I'm even perpetuating, or I'm experiencing bias, and this is what needs to change. So bringing it back to psychological safety, it was a concept really brought to the fore by Dr. Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School. And what I love about psychological safety is it certainly has to do with who feels safe enough to like speak up, raise their hand, raise issues, all of that. But it's also who feels safe and like they won't lose their status or their job, or be thought of as less than if they fail. And I think that's a concept where that's where psychological safety, that's what I find really, really special and powerful about it, is it's not just, can you speak up, can you say what you want to say, which is very important, but it's saying I have the safety to fail, right? And we're hardwired to want to get along, we're hardwired to be liked, right? So much of us as social animals, as humans, we want to be liked. And what psychological safety does is it says, we're going to create an environment for you where you don't have to risk, losing status or losing face or even losing your job because you challenge status quo, or because you failed, or you asked your stupid question, or you made a mistake. And now the amazing thing about psychological safety is, teams where there's psychological safety and organizations where there's psychological safety are much more innovative and high growth than teams where that doesn't exist. And Dr. Edmondson's work itself has found that actually there are, even in very, very high risk, very, very challenging situations, such as like she's conducted research in the neonatal ICU, where having someone with quote unquote like lower status speak up and say, challenge the doctor. For example, a nurse can challenge the doctor and say, hey, I don't think we should, I think we should do a different intervention, or we shouldn't use this drug, or we should do this, actually had life-saving outcomes, without us kind of relying on the way things are normally done, where it's like the doctor, the person in the highest status and power, they're the only ones who can make decisions. And I think this has huge ramifications for inclusion, because again, research shows the people who generally have the least amount of psychological safety in an organization, unless you're being very intentional about it, are women, people of color, people from the LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, and other marginalized identities, especially if those marginalized identities are intersectional and compound with each other.
What creates a sense of psychological safety in an organization or a workplace, and what takes it away? And I assume this is like, there's robust research behind this.
There is. And there are a couple of things which I think are really important when we think about how to create psychological safety. At its core, the feeling is, does my team have my back? Do people I work with, do they have my back, right? If we were to like strip away all the academic and all the other definitions, it is literally, I feel like I am safe here and that people have my back. And the reality, as I said, unfortunately, the more marginalized identities you carry, typically the less psychological safety you have. So I think for people who are listening, who want to create a sense of psychological safety on the team, there are a couple of ways, research back, that really work. And one of them is creating a growth mindset culture within the team, right? One where we're here because nobody has all the answers. We care deeply about growth. We care deeply about learning. We care deeply about, like, if you make mistakes, you can recover from it. And that's something that when leaders, especially people with more privilege and power, and again, when I talk about leaders, I certainly mean people who have those titles and those positions, but it's also people with privilege and power in the workplace who can, in dominant groups, who can speak up and say, I want to make sure like everyone here feels like they can that they can fail and they can be safe when they fail. They can take a risk. And I think these are very, very important ways to model creating psychological safety. I think taking this concept of failure, this is what I'm really fascinated about, because I'm really fascinated by the fact that the more women of color I speak to, the more I hear this concept. In fact, just this morning, I was talking to a network of women, largely made up of women of color, who talked about how they feel immense pressure to be perfect and never to fail. So I think for folks who can model, like, it is okay to fail, we are actually going to talk about our failures. Dr. Edmondson's research found in hospital settings, especially, having what she called a failure event analysis. What it really means is a debrief, right? Like having a debrief. Hey, we made a mistake. This is what happened. This is how we failed. This is what we learned from it. Can really create psychological safety. And yet, in so many organizations and industries today, there is still that pressure to be perfect, to never make a mistake. And if you fail, which we all will, because we just all will, then it's like, oh, I better hide that. I better not own up to it. I better not live it. And I think that's something that we can all learn from.
And so do you think, I mean, so one has this knowledge that, oh, it's important, even if you're like a manager or like a senior manager, running a company, that of the importance of creating a sense of psychological safety among all team members. Do you think one that has to come from the top of an organization, or can it be done like in your own little bubble? Let's say if you are a manager in an organization and you want your team to be safe within, somewhat larger Fortune 500 corporation, can it be done? Or do you think this has to be approached on a much more systemic level? And you have like interesting examples of companies who kind of went to the mat to try to change things, whether or not, Starbucks or Intel or Adobe with the pay leveling. So what can actually be done? Like we know some of the problems, but how do you change it and move the needle?
Here's what's funny, Jenny, or here's what's interesting. I think the approach is both and. So in the book, I talk about a team I've personally worked with. My organization, Canada has advised for a number of years, which is a very innovative team led by a very innovative leader, a white man who deeply, deeply cares about inclusion and prioritizes it, working within a larger organization, which isn't quite at the same place, right? And had created a lot of blockers to both this leader's focus on DEI, as well as working with me and things like that. And I think what has been fascinating is having that much of, being so sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging are very, very important, being super sure and going out to bat for it, even in the face of resistance, and using their privilege to say, look, you made me a leader for a reason. This is something I deeply care about, and I'm going to go ahead with it, even when I face resistance. And that was an example where I actually saw someone within, creating a team where psychological safety, where inclusion, where equity, we're really facing up to what were the practices and norms that were exclusionary, and changing them and dismantling them was high priority within a larger structure, which wasn't really quite at the same place. So I have seen success there. But to really have, to really create long-lasting, sustainable change, to really create structures where it's not just your luck of like, will you show up and you're lucky to have a great manager, or you're lucky to have a leader who's inclusive. But if you change any other part of, you get a promotion, you move to a different part of the organization, you're going to have a terrible experience. To really operationalize it, we do need people at the top in very senior positions taking a stance and making a change. I'll just give you one example actually from my previous book, The Diversity Advantage, which focused more on gender balanced organizations. And sadly, I think given just the reality of where we've seen academic and other organizational research be guided by the issues we see in society in general, and who has power and privilege, there's a lot more research done around organizations that are gender balanced, and a lot less organizational and academic research done on what it looks like to create an anti-racist and racially balanced and racially diverse organization. But with my first book, when I was looking into what gender balanced organizations had in common, it didn't matter their location, it didn't matter their industry, it didn't matter their size, it didn't matter, literally no other factor mattered except for leadership buy-in. That was the only commonality among all these organizations that had created some semblance of, of gender progress and opportunities for women to succeed and thrive. And so that told me very clearly, we do need leadership buy-in, and that is probably one of the most important factors to make true change.
And since 2020, with all, there was this whole huge flux after George Floyd protests, a lot of companies, there was a whole range of reactions, right? From the the Black Square on Instagram all the way up to sort of policy changes, 15%, promise of spending on products on shelves or whatnot. I was wondering from your conversations in the last 2 years, where you've seen companies that have actually made progress, you can abstract or anonymize them, and where it was sort of more of a spurt of sorts, and then maybe leadership change or other priorities came, or I don't know, the economy, COVID still continues to be a big economic drain. What has happened in the workplace in the last 2 years?
Great question. I wish I could say that there was a monumental change made. I wish I could say that it became clear to me that this was the moment that we all needed, right? And it really, we looked at a worldwide reigniting of a worldwide global movement for racial justice, right? Sparked by the very tragic murder of George Floyd and other unarmed Black people. And what I have to say, what I think is really, really, for me, this is a very nuanced sort of conversation. So on the one hand, I will say I haven't seen the type of progress that I'd like to see, and actually recently just read an article where truly most of the companies that actually promised to make great change actually didn't end up making that much of change, right? So the research 2 years down the line doesn't back up a lot of those early, we're going to do these huge things. So that's the reality on the one hand. On the other, and because I'm a glass half full type of person, one of the things that I saw post 2020 that I hadn't seen in all the years that I have worked in both DEIB as a practitioner and as someone who talks about this, but also in the years, like yourself, being a former business journalist, I covered companies, right? I'm sure you can think of the organizations that you were covering as well, where talking about racism, talking about racial injustice was like, what do you mean? No, 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 like, please don't, like, don't even go down that, don't go down that road. I don't want to have this conversation. I'm not ready. I don't have the language. I don't have the ability, the competency to really talk about this. That's changed. How much action have we seen? I wouldn't say that much, but I think being able to acknowledge many more leaders, especially people with white privilege, with cis male privilege, with, you know, being straight privilege, a lot more leaders than I've ever met before at least acknowledge the existence of racism and the reality that racism is the biggest, I mean, in my mind, the biggest, but in others, at least there's some acknowledgement of it being a huge barrier in the progress of people of color in this country and others around the world.
And with remote being a very common, if not dominant, way of working, at least within sort of the, you know, white collar industries, do you have you found, and I've, you know, read the articles, that in some ways people, you know, women of a color sometimes prefer that because you kind of can escape the little microaggressions that, you know, that kind of bombard you on a day-to-day basis. And so, but, you know, there's also some disadvantages to that in terms of you know, having FaceTime with the powers that be, and, you know, maybe it sort of entrenches already existing relationships rather than allowing, you know, the face-to-face serendipity that allows you to build stronger ones. What have you heard from different companies and in from your own kind of observational research or of sorts in terms of the role that remote working can play in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Great question, Jenny. I wrote an article last year for the New York Times on how women of color were not ready to return to the office. A big part of it, and, you know, research by Future Forum, which is a think tank from Slack, found that there was a huge disparity in the number of Black workers who wanted to return to the workplace versus white workers, to the in-office workplace environment. And a big part of it was indeed facing, and, you know, I personally, and even in the book, I don't like to use the term microaggressions. I understand, you know, it's a good way for us to understand, you know, hopefully come up with a common language to describe what it means to face bias. But really, I use biased behaviors and exclusionary actions because what I find is that, and what research shows, is facing these often daily, a bombardment of them, as you say, is anything but micro, and can have a huge impact on your sense of self and your sense of belonging, on all of those things. So again, women of color I spoke to, not ready to move back into an in-office environment. I think in addition, the reality is the research shows you don't need to be in an in-office environment to be more productive, or even to be more innovative, or even to form new relationships. But the challenge that I think workers who, again, indeed white collar workers are facing, who feel compelled to go back to an in-office environment, is that without that intentionality, without the why are we actually having this meeting, what is the actual purpose of us having it in person versus people being able to dial in remotely, for example, we're seeing a lot of those same issues happening again, where indeed people who already had the network, who already had status in the organization, are continuing to have that, and that's just being reinforced in the in-office environment. I'm very, very remote first, and I actually think that there's a unique opportunity to be inclusive in a remote environment, right? I mean, I'm thinking of someone, I'm thinking of myself, for example. Most of the time when I meet people in person, and they've seen my name somewhere on, in a meeting agenda or something, immediately I get into this like, oh my gosh, like cringe, they're going to mispronounce my name. Like, how do I get into get in before the meeting to like make sure they pronounce my name correctly. This is something that's really important to me. I've written about this. What I love about the virtual environment is both in my email signature, as well as when I start off a meeting, I'll make sure I'll pronounce my name Ruchika Toshian. I've been able to put it into my name. I didn't today, but in general, it's there. You know, my name pronounces there. And these are ways that really, you know, this is a small example. I'm using a small example where I think of gender pronouns, I think of other ways. We can raise our hand, we can use the chat function to make sure that we all share space equitably. And I think, again, in every situation, it takes intention. So I really hope that when companies, as they're planning, you know, a more sort of, whether it's 5 days a week or whatever it is, back into an in-office environment, I hope they plan it with really centering the voices of people who have long been excluded in these conversations.
In terms of the gender pronouns, I know we kind of spark that mostly in terms of people who may or may not be binary or whatnot. But actually, one of the most interesting use cases when you mention names is, at least for Chinese names that are not, or foreign names in general, where it's not obvious what the gender of the person is. Like if your name is Jing Chen, that could be male or female. And it's actually nice to be able to indicate in your signature now if you are male or female, because you will get the Mr. Jing Chen when it's a Miss, Jing Chen or whatnot. So there's sort of like sometimes like knock-on effects of some of the inclusion policies that we have that then, touch others who are maybe not the primary target of this policy.
Yes.
So one of the things that I was kind of interested in is this phrase that you use called underestimated versus underrepresented, and like why that is an important framing device for just how we think about the different populations. And the other thing that I want to point out, which is so fascinating, is how obsessed America is as a culture with putting people in little boxes of like what you are. It goes all the way back, if anyone is curious, there's a website called racebox.org, which is all of the census designations that we've had since the beginning of the United States. And so it's fascinating to see what comes in those, including like, in the earliest ones, you have octoroon and quadroon, which are people who are 1/8 Black and 1/4 Black. So it shows you the kinds of things the United States was obsessed about in terms of boxes. And we continue to get, because I'm sure you get the tastefully asked, what are you? But I mean, it's phrased in different ways always. But, in terms of one of the phrases that we often use now is underrepresented, minorities. But you have a different kind of framing device, and I was wondering if you could speak to it.
Yeah, Jenny, can I just say that this weekend I was put it on my Instagram and Twitter because I was so annoyed. I was asked about like why do you not have an accent? I was asked this question at a party, and it was really painful. I was a bit like, we just met. I'll probably never see you again. Why does me not having an accent, which I have an accent, obviously, but essentially this person was kind of like, why does the way you present not match what I think you should sound like? And then when I said I'm from Singapore, this person was absolutely was not having it and had to find out, like, did you go to an American school? Like, why is your accent like? And it got to that stage of, being very impolitely asked, like, what are you? So, yeah, and I laugh, and I laugh because I think I've tried very hard to step into my power and feel very comfortable with like, this is what I am, and I don't feel like I have to whatever justify it or placate you or whatever it is. But I do remember those days when I was, especially in corporate America, when I was in corporations, when I was much younger, when I was the only, feeling really, really ashamed, wishing I had a different name, wishing I sounded different, all of those things. And so I can't say enough how much, and I want to use that as an example to say, often it doesn't matter whether we're represented, whether we're really there or not, right? Often we make it to the representation. We become the first or one of the few women of color, Black women, Asian women, Indian women, whatever it is. And then we may be there in terms of being represented physically, but we're still underestimated. We're still overlooked. Our names, having a name like Ruchika means people often don't want to say it, right? It's unfamiliar. It may cause awkwardness. It's unfamiliar. I would realize, like, sometimes some of my colleagues wouldn't look me in the eye because they didn't want to call upon me to say, like, oh yeah, what do you think? So I think shifting the framing away from underrepresented really then puts the blame or the onus on people who are in minority groups, right? Could be racial, could be gender, could be all other forms of minoritization. The onus becomes on us to fix it and be represented. Whereas what we find again and again, that the importance is for people who have long been overlooked in the workplace to recognize that they have often been underestimated, right? And that is the challenge that most of us face, even when we actually end up becoming physically present. When we get those big jobs, when we get those big roles, we just need to look at huge, examples of, whether it's celebrities, whether it's politicians, whether it's other people from identities that have commonly been overlooked. It's usually the issues are not that we necessarily are not represented, but that we have been underestimated even when we get there.
And in terms of also phrases that are commonly used in the workplace, and I remember this when I was doing recruiting as a senior year, which is the idea of like, oh, are you a culture fit? Whether or not it's for consulting companies or investment banks, very commonly. It is, as they told us back then, so this is in the late 90s, would you want to be stuck in an airport with this person for 8 hours because like a snowstorm? And I thought it was interesting. First of all, I thought it was weird. I thought it was weird back then, and I continue to think it is weird now as a test for hiring someone in terms of their competency. But there's a danger in that phrase and that kind of thinking. And kind of was wondering, what you'd observed and if there has been a pushback systemically towards, whatever danger something like that represents.
I think this is such a good question, and one of the surprising things is I definitely observed it in the 2000s and all of that. You talked about it being something you saw in the 90s. It still continues to be an issue to this day. Some of the teams I work with, when they talk about inclusive hiring, when we look at what are the changes, what are the interventions that need to happen for there to be more inclusive hiring, for example, is often decisions on who to hire are based on, and literally there's like conversations ad nauseum, like, would I go for a beer with this person? Yeah. Would I, did we have the same sports team that we enjoy, like that we both support, and therefore let's talk about that. Like I felt like I could talk about them, and therefore they should get hired, which of course has nothing to do with a job. I have to say the one and only time this example backfired on me is when I spoke at a college, on a college campus, which had a very strong football team, and that was like. So the person who asked the question ended up being the marketing person for the sports team, and I was like, yes, okay, that is where everyone should want to like support that sports team, but literally in no other example does that hold up. And yet we make decisions based on that. People in corporations make decisions based on that literally every single day. It is exclusionary. It does perpetuate bias. It actually perpetuates one of the lesser known and more innocuous biases that actually have a major impact on why we don't have a diverse and inclusive, literally workplaces, why we don't have diverse and inclusive workplaces today. And that's affinity bias, same as me bias, right? Feels very innocuous. Like, are we, I like you because you're the same gender, you're the same race, you like the same sports team as me, you're from the same hometown as me. Of course, like we feel more comfortable in those situations. And when you make hiring decisions, when you make promotion decisions today based on affinity bias, which most of us do, if we're not intentional about it, we do end up creating a culture where people are very, very similar in that organization, and that stifles innovation, it stifles creativity, and indeed, it is a big blocker to creating more diverse and inclusive workplace. So I think what we need now, and I would like to see more organizations push back against, let's hire for culture fit or let's promote for culture fit, and really take a hard critical look at who's missing today, especially by demographics. Are women of color present here? Who's not present? What do we need to add to the culture today? So when I advise organizations, I say, let's move away from culture fit towards culture add.
And in terms of other kinds of workplace, I guess, strategies, there's a acronym I see often, which was very weird when I first saw it, which is ERG, which stands for, I guess, Employee Resource Group. And I don't know when that term as an acronym popped up, but this idea of like affinity groups. So two things I thought were interesting from your book. So one is you make the point that Xerox started them in 1964 or so, and that this is very quick in the book. So I'm kind of wondering if you can kind of flesh it out a little bit, that it basically paved the way for Xerox to have the first female Black CEO in the Fortune 500, which is kind of a stunning figure, actually, if you think about like 500 one Black female CEO. And you know whatever that path was, that sort of laid the groundwork for that. And then the other point that I found really interesting is, and I've sort of maybe seen this mostly because I am a speaker that is often like the Asian American like API month speaker, Clorox, which is a company, I guess, like invited me to come speak. So I often interact with them because I'm like the choice speaker of like the month of being like professionally Asian. This idea that you need to resource them to do what it is that you actually want them to do and not have to beg for their budget, right? And and because I can sometimes feel like how resourced they are when they ask me to come speak in other aspects of whatever they're doing. So just if you can speak to like the role that ERGs or similar things can play in a corporate environment, and where they actually have been known to make a difference.
Yeah, I love, and for the book, I researched the first known example of an ERG, as they're called, BRGs, affinity groups, etc. But it's essentially a convening of people of largely an underestimated identity coming together and being able to form affinity and connection with each other, which is more the modern day version of it. I love the example of Xerox because when the CEO at that time, and I forget his name, was a white man, really put together the first affinity group, the genesis of where we know this comes from, is it was really because Xerox was headquartered in a place which was dealing with the aftershocks of racial riots, and he, the CEO, really wanted to ensure that especially Black employees would feel supported, would be able to come to the workplace and feel like they were safe, right? Literally, that was why it was created. And so what the CEO did of Xerox at that time in the 1960s, indeed, I think it was 64, is he convened, Black employees from a variety of different parts of the company in a town hall, essentially, and said like, hey, we're in this, like, there's this political climate happening, that we're operating in. It's a really, really tense time. What can I do? And what can Xerox as a company do to support you, right? Since then, and that was really monumental. And, as I wrote in the book, like, things happen for a variety of reasons. So nobody can say it was exactly that reason that then eventually, decades later, resulted in Ursula Burns becoming the CEO of Xerox and being the first Black female CEO in the Fortune 500, which indeed shocking and still continues to be. She's still in a very, very small club all these years later. However, I think having that intentionality of like, we need to name the problem. Racism is a problem. Our Black employees are not feeling safe, and we need to do better. And we need to put institutional muscle behind ensuring that we solve the problems. And not, again, not like, oh, I know the answer, but more like, can you tell me what I need to do, right? Listening with empathy, with humility, with an open mind, you know, tell me what I need to do, not like I'm going to show up and tell you what you need from me. I really think that's lay the groundwork for, you know, Ursula Burns. I think the problem we see today is a lot of ERGs are underfunded and they do not serve an institutional purpose. It's totally fine to convene with people and have moments where you can really share and be sort of vulnerable. I really love that. And I really wish I had, you know, ERGs in places I worked at. In journalism, you rarely see it, certainly when I was starting out. And even in other organizations I worked at, there were never any really robust ERGs. That has its place, but where I've seen innovative organizations really make change is leveraging the power of ERGs to inform culture, to inform business strategy, to inform marketing strategy. I have examples of that in the book. And I think that's where there's that difference between we're just convening because it's like everyone has a women's network and we're all just hanging out and we're having a happy hour, to no, like we are leveraging the incredible power and leadership we have here to guide our strategy as an organization.
That's cool. So I think Nicholas
Yes, I think we're at questions.
in.
Thank you so much for that terrific conversation. Thank you to you
Thank
both.
you.
As you said, yeah, we now have some time for some questions from the audience. So audience, please put any questions you would like to ask in the Q&A if you haven't already. I think we have one already, Jenny.
Yeah, we have, so here's a question. So the book has been out for a couple of months now, and we're kind of curious about what kind of reaction you're getting from readers, you know, sliced up by, I guess, groups. So
Demographics,
women
yeah.
of color, you know, from the managers, from, you know, the worker bees and all that. What do you hear, and who is buying the book?
Yeah, I have to say this is really humbling. I have to say, like, certainly, I mean, Nicholas, I know when we've had our conversations, Nicholas was obviously very much involved, you know, once the book was in production and we talked about, okay, like getting the name out. It's kind of like, you know, I think it's going to be like me and my mom who buy the book and that's it. And it's been really, yeah, it really is. It feels very humbling. The reality is it's been a very wide cross-section of people who have bought the book, which again, as a glass half full kind of person, it gives me a lot of optimism that we are in this place where people understand that this is an issue and they really want to spend time understanding and figuring out where they can both build their awareness as well as then move into action. Of course, when I meet women of color, majority of conversations I have with women of color is, thank you for naming the challenges I've faced. Thank you for validating my experience. In many ways, I wrote this book because 10 years ago when I was in tech, I would have loved to have something say to me, some resource validate that it wasn't in my head. I was often gaslighting myself. Ruchika, you're just not trying hard enough. You're not advocating for yourself enough. You're not leaning in enough. That's also, of course, what I heard. And so I feel really blessed that there are people who come to me and say, like, thank you for validating my experience. It really is a pretty amazing experience. I thought I would deal with a lot of white fragility. I don't know. And when I say white fragility, I don't mean, you know, my focus has always been on systems, not individuals. So I have certainly faced a lot of fragility, even from people of color. I've certainly faced fragility from even people who look like me. And I thought that I would get a lot more, right? A lot of like, no, it's just, you know, this doesn't exist. And, you know, it's just people like trying to play the victim. I thought I would face a lot of that. It hasn't happened yet. Maybe the book needs to be out for a little bit longer. I face pockets of like, you know, I face pockets of like defensiveness, like, oh, you know, could you not use this term? Or I think it would be more effective if you didn't just focus on like what men do wrong or whatever it is. And then I really have to double down and say, like, truly, in my experience, it is a systemic issue. In fact, many times where I have felt the most amount of support have actually come from cis white men, and where I have sometimes faced challenges have been women of color. And I'm able to name and understand that it's because we do operate in a system which creates very little room at the top, right? And so a lot of us feel maybe like we need to have our sharp elbows out to proceed and to progress. And I'm hopeful that we could change that narrative.
And so what are some of the biggest challenges individuals and organizations may face when they actually try to implement what you suggest in the book? So that's one. And two, I assume for many people in the chat, of which there are almost 50 in terms of the pure audience, not all of them are probably managers and people of authority of color. So if you are like a line worker, worker bee type, what can you do if one reads the book? What can you do within your organization to at least try to move the organization towards some of the strategies that you talk in the book?
Yeah,
so those are the two.
Yeah. That's great. I think the first is the biggest challenge is people are in different stages of the journey, and they may have a different understanding of what it means to create a more inclusive organization. One of the biggest barriers I see today is the myth of meritocracy. I write about this in the book very early on. I talk about how I was very deeply steeped into this idea, right? First woman in my ancestors to work outside the home in paid work, grew up in Singapore, which markets itself as a country that went from, their words, not mine, third world to first world within a few generations through sheer hard work. So really bought into this idea like, the harder you work, the further you'll go. And having to decolonize myself from that mindset is very much part of the work that I've done and continue to do in very many different ways. And so I think the biggest barrier and challenge we face today is that people are going to be in different stages of their journey. And how do we get folks around a common understanding? How do we make it so that in the same way it's absurd to say like the earth is flat, we also are able to say like, yes, racism exists, gender bias exists, right? And that is something that I would really like to see certainly in my lifetime. I think I get asked this question a lot from people who are not in positions of leadership and authority. And I want to start by saying it is not your problem to fix. I understand it is very important. We all need to be aware and we all need to do our parts. It's also a problem. Honestly, the further you are from the centers of power, the less it is your experience to fix. And I say this because I've met so many people, so many women of color specifically, who are furthest away from the center of power, who have worked tirelessly and then burnt out. And it becomes really hard to carry on. So I want to start with that caveat. It is not your problem to fix. Now, if you find yourself in a position where you're like, okay, this is, I need to start, I need to be the person, I need to at least kickstart things. I think it's important to find people who practice allyship. And I use allyship and ally, and I know Jenny, we were talking about this at the start of this call. I use allyship as a verb, not a noun. And so people who, amplify the voices of other people, people with underestimated identities in meetings, right? Like they will amplify, oh, Chika said this, I'm gonna amplify this and build upon that, right? People who really show up for other people, it's important to build coalition with them and say, like, here are some of the challenges I'm seeing here. What do you think? How can we make change together? There's no, I wish there was like a perfect playbook. I want to acknowledge that this is really hard work. Again, the further you are from the center of power, the harder it can be. And sometimes, this is controversial. I think more of us in this field are recognizing sometimes to preserve your health and your mental health, sometimes you just have to walk away, right? And I know there's privilege inherent in that statement, but I'm starting to see more and more, especially women of color, saying, I can't deal with this anymore.
So this question, I'm trying to clarify a little bit, but basically, what can someone do in terms of asking tastefully, what can I do to support you without increasing the expectation of unpaid labor from the underestimated groups? Trying to clarify the question, but I'm trying to figure out basically if the person who's being asked to support is someone from an underestimated group or actually someone from management who has power. But either way,
dominant group.
Yeah, dominant group. But interpret the question however you wish you want. But it's the idea of, you know, how you can offer, you want to move things forward. And then a problem that you do mention in your book, and I've seen many different places, is that the burden of doing the you know, employee resource or, you know, building these networks and of psychological safety often falls on the people in the underestimated groups who have to do it on top of their normal jobs, right? And it often doesn't get funneled into any kind of promotion consideration. So you end up kind of having this extracurricular that is both emotionally draining and not necessarily an upside from a personal career perspective.
You're so right. I have to say the resources really exist outside having to have a one-on-one conversation with people in the beginning, right? And I always, and I think of, you know, I think of the few times like now I'm in spaces like not even full-time, but part-time. I think of the time where I've been in academia when I teach a college class. And in those spaces, I think of the times where I've been with, you know, especially white leaders, people with, you know, both sort of status in terms of by title as well as by certainly societal privilege. And I think of those situations where I've been asked some version of this question, like, how can I support you as, you know, as an adjunct, as someone who, you know, is a worker of color, et cetera. And I can really sense the difference between people who ask me that question and they've done the self-awareness, they've done the education, they've read the books, they've really gone out of their way and come pretty far in their journey so that when they come to me, they're genuinely asking for like, okay, in this specific tactical situation, what can I do, right? Versus the people who are kind of like, oh, I read in the news that this issue is happening. All right, can we just meet and like, can you just educate me on like what I need to do? And it's become very clear. And when I speak with, especially when I spoke with women of color for the book, it was very clear where people landed sort of on that spectrum of like, I've done the work, I've done the self-education. I know I'm not going to get a medal for it and I've still done it. And therefore I'm coming to you with quite a lot of knowledge where I'm not expecting you to educate me. I'm just asking for tactical ways that I can support you versus like educate me and do all that additional labor. So I think the number one thing is like really doing the work and really seeking out resources. There are plenty of amazing books out there. One of the ones that I love is Minda Harts's The Memo is really, really an amazing book, as well as Right Within, focused on how do we support Black women in the workplace and some of the challenges Black women face in the workplace. Obviously, understanding the historical context. I love Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and there are a number of fantastic books out there. Caste is amazing. So I think there is that. I think the other part of this, which I think doesn't get talked about enough, and I'm so glad, Jenny, you talked about it, and I want to be quick about this, is that indeed there's a lot of additional labor put on people from underestimated backgrounds, whether it is serving on ERGs, whether it is to be the token person talking about an issue. And on top of that, at a time where so many of us face so many real threats, right? I mean, it was just, Jenny, I don't know if you've seen this, but honestly, before 2021, nobody I had ever met, no leader I'd ever met talked about anti-Asian violence, right? Mm-hmm. Until there was very deep coverage, fortunately, finally, and in the media of what anti-Asian and the rise of especially anti-Asian, East Asian violence towards women. And it was just shocking to me because for many of us who live in the community, very much a real threat that we've dealt with for years. So I just want to say that I think that for us, especially from underestimated communities, we're doing the labor of education and awareness building and being part of the ERGs and all of that. And we are living these very real threats, even outside the organization and outside our workplaces. So having deep empathy for that, and building your own awareness of that, I think, is extremely important now, especially given the larger political, people from the LGBTQ community, anyone who is a birthing person. I mean, we are really at a point which feels really fraught. And of course, we can't separate that and come into, the workplace and be sort of a robot. We bring all of that in with us.
I have one more question, which is sort of a something that I've actually had to deal with as well, which is equitable hiring practices. So just to give you an example, and you mentioned this in your book, which is this idea of like auditioning people for the job you actually want to do. So we do not actually start, for my company Plimpton, which hires a lot of young people to work in sort of the publishing space. One, we don't start with the interview. We start actually with a blind exercise. And then it is actually a pretty intense exercise. So we pay them for their time to do it. So
Yes.
usually say $20 an hour, don't spend more than 5 hours. And it instills a certain amount of discipline on us, because you have to decide, is this person worth spending $100 on to evaluate? But it also saves us time, because you don't have to do an interview, if that makes sense. And so I like that for many different reasons, that it puts the interview last as opposed to first. and there's some other kind of techniques that we use, but was wondering what you've seen in terms of leveling.
That is fantastic. I think that's the voice style auditions is what I talked about in my book. Certainly very much more present in the tech industry, but still not widely adapted, which is something, or widely adopted rather. And that is really disappointing. But indeed, more sort of you don't see the person and you have them complete a task, because at the end of the day, that's really important. The other thing is, I think one thing that I'm trying to level up on, and recently I feel like there's a confluence of factors, having me meet more leaders who are trying to create where you don't screen out applicants who have a criminal background, right?
Or college, right?
And then the college education. We know disproportionate communities of color, especially Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, face huge barriers to access to college. And so, because of racism, and I've seen that become something that's become, much more common, but certainly not widely adopted. I think the last part, and I know we're at time, I think the last part of this is really what would be, I wish this is a takeaway that we would all have, is when you see bias occurring in the hiring process, and this is later down the line, whether it's a debrief of an interview or when you decide to make a job offer, or whether you're talking about salaries, I wish more of us would just stop and say for a moment, like, where could bias be showing up in this decision, right? And that's where, if we could start naming it, more of us could say, hey, we offered the man $50,000 for this job, but we offered the woman for the same job $45,000, right? Where could bias be showing up in this decision? Is one of the ways that I think we could really start making, it's uncomfortable, and if we all did it, we could really start naming how these exclusionary practices show up.
Yeah. So Nicholas,
Thank you guys so much. Thanks so much to our guests today, Ruchika Tulshian and Jennifer A. Lee. If you'd like to learn more about Inclusion on Purpose, please see the link in the chat. We hope to see you at our next DPL and MIT Press event on Wednesday, September 14th. The program will feature author Emily West discussing her new book, Buy Now, How Amazon Branded Convenience and Normalized Monopoly. Very important read. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us for this conversation, and goodbye. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Jenny. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Be well. Bye.
Bye.